I never intended to fall in love with her handwriting before I ever loved her voice. That's the truth of it, and I've turned it over enough winters now that I trust it the way I trust the weight of a good axe in my hand. She had a way of making a 6 look like it was leaning into the wind, and by the second week, I found myself opening the ledger before the coffee had even finished boiling, just to see what she'd written the day before. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I want to tell you I did. I didn't. If she'd left that January, like most men in this territory expected a widow with no kin to leave, I would have lost more than a bookkeeper. I would have lost the only reason I had left for keeping the lamp lit past dark. That's not a thing a man says out loud, not in 1885, not in a house that still smelled faintly of his dead wife's rosewater soap. But it was true before I ever let myself think it, and it stayed true long after I did. My name is Caleb Hargrove, and I'd run 4,000 acres of grazing land outside Sweetwater, Wyoming territory for the better part of 30 years. My wife Ellen and I built that ranch out of nothing but stubbornness and a homestead claim, back when the act still promised a man 160 acres if he could prove he'd worked the land for 5 straight years without abandoning it. We proved it. We fenced it, we dug the well by hand, we buried 2 infants in the process. And in the end, I buried Ellen too, 3 winters back, when a fever took her faster than I could get a doctor across a river running high with snowmelt. I have never forgiven that river. I'm not certain I've forgiven myself either, though I've stopped saying so, even to God. By the fall of '85, the ranch was still mine, but my eyes had started failing me in ways I didn't want to admit to any man in town. The columns of the ledgers swam if I read them too long by lamplight. I'd already lost 200 head to blackleg the winter before, and the note I owed at the Sweetwater Bank was larger than I liked to say aloud, even to my own foreman. A cowboy's wage in those years ran $25 to $40 a month, and I was carrying 3 hired hands through the calving season on top of what I owed. I needed someone who could read a column of figures true and write it down honest, and I needed it cheap, because cheap was what I had left to offer. That was how I came to hire Margaret Doyle. I knew of her the way everyone in a town of 400 people knows of a widow alone on a homestead claim, which is to say, I knew the shape of her trouble before I ever knew her face. Her husband Daniel had fallen from the loft rafters raising their barn 2 summers past, and she'd been proving up that claim by herself ever since. 160 acres of good bottomland that Elias Sutter at the bank had made no secret of wanting for himself, should she fail to hold it the full 5 years required by law. She kept chickens. She took in mending. She sold eggs at 4 cents apiece to families who could have gathered their own, just so they'd have a reason to put coin in her hand instead of charity. I'd heard she baked bread twice a week and sold the extra loaves to the mercantile for a nickel apiece, and that she'd mended the school teacher's coat through an entire hard winter rather than let the woman go without in the cold. I did not hire her out of kindness. I want that understood plainly, because kindness was not a thing I trusted myself with anymore. I hired her because Sutter mentioned, almost carelessly over a counter of feed sacks, that the widow Doyle had a fine hand for figures. Her father had been a school teacher back in Ohio, and because I was too proud to ride into town and ask a man to do sums for me like I was some green boy who'd never held a pencil. I rode out to her claim on a gray Tuesday morning, my hat in my hand before I'd even reached her door, feeling every one of my 54 years, and none of the certainty I usually carried onto my own land. Her cabin was smaller than mine by half, but tidier than I expected from a place run by one woman alone through 2 winters. The fence was mended clean, the woodpiles stacked square against the north wall where the snow would come hardest, and a half-dozen hens scattered at my approach, like they too had learned to be wary of strangers. She answered the door in a dove-gray blouse buttoned to the throat, her chestnut hair pinned back loosely, and she did not smile at me. I remember thinking that was the first honest thing about her. "I understand you need your books kept," she said. Not a question. "I do. I charge $1 a week and I won't be spoken down to." I nearly laughed. Nobody had spoken to me that plainly since Ellen. "$1 a week's fair," I said, and that was the whole of our negotiation. She rode out to the ranch 2 days later on a borrowed mare, a satchel of her own pencils slung over one shoulder, and I remember standing at my own gate feeling like the visitor on my own land. She worked at the kitchen table each afternoon, 3 hours at a stretch, and I learned quick that she did not care to be watched while she worked, so I found reasons to be elsewhere, mending fence that didn't need mending, currying a horse that was already curried, walking the fence line twice in one afternoon just to have somewhere to put my hands. But I'd come back in for coffee and find her frowning at a column, chewing the end of her pencil, chestnut hair coming loose from its pins by the 3rd hour of every afternoon, and something in me went soft and useless in a way I hadn't allowed since Ellen died. I told myself it was only that the house had been too quiet too long. I believed that for almost 6 weeks. The weeks themselves had a rhythm I hadn't expected to welcome. She'd arrive by mid-morning and I'd have coffee started, and we'd trade maybe a dozen words about the weather or the cattle before she settled into the ledger and I found my chores. By late October, the leaves had gone the color of old pennies across the north pasture, and I noticed I'd started listening for the sound of her mare on the road before I let myself admit I was listening for anything at all. Some afternoons, she brought bread she'd baked that morning, still warm, and left half a loaf on my table without comment, and I ate it slower than a man needs to eat bread, just to make it last. The wound in me was not hard to name if I'd ever let myself name it. I had not called the doctor soon enough for Ellen. I had waited a full day, certain the fever would break on its own the way fevers sometimes did, and by the time I saddled a horse and rode for Sweetwater, the river had risen past the ford, and I lost 4 hours finding a way across. 4 hours. I have counted them more times than I can say. Ellen died before the doctor ever reached our door, and I have never once told another living soul that I believe those 4 hours are the reason. I did not know that autumn that Meg carried a wound cut from the same cloth. It came out sideways, the way true things often do, on an evening in November when a hard frost had come early and she'd stayed later than usual finishing the month's accounts. I brought her coffee without thinking on it, the way I might have once brought Ellen coffee, and she wrapped both hands around the cup like she needed the warmth of it more than the drink. "Ask me not to help him with that roof," she said, out of nowhere, staring at the lamp instead of at me. Said it was man's work. I let him tell me that. I was in the kitchen putting up preserves when he fell, and I didn't even hear it happen. I found out because the hired boy came running. I didn't say anything for a long moment. There are things a man learns not to rush past. "I keep thinking," she went on, "that if I'd been up there with him, arguing with him the way I wanted to, he might have had one more pair of hands to catch himself with. I'll never know. That's the part that sits worst, not knowing." "I know exactly 4 hours," I said, before I decided to say it. 4 hours it took me to cross that river the day Ellen died. I've never told anyone that I count them. She looked at me then, really looked, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with numbers in a ledger. Neither of us reached for the other. Neither of us needed to, not yet. But the silence after was not an empty one. It was the kind that says more than most conversations manage. Through December, something shifted that I could not have named plainly even if you'd asked me at gunpoint. She began staying past her 3 hours without either of us remarking on it. I began finding reasons to sit across from her instead of finding reasons to be elsewhere. We did not speak of Daniel or Ellen again, not directly, but I noticed she'd stopped wearing black entirely by the new year, and I noticed it. She'd taken to humming while she worked some afternoons. Nothing I recognized, just some old hymn tune worn soft at the edges. And I found myself listening for that too, the way a man listens for weather he's hoping will hold. There was an evening near Christmas when the whole territory went still under snow, and she stayed longer than usual because the roads had gone bad. And we sat by the stove, and she told me about her father's schoolhouse back in Ohio. And I told her about the year Ellen and I lost the whole spring calf crop to a late blizzard and nearly gave up the claim before it was even proved. I hadn't told that story to another living soul. She listened the way a person listens when they mean to remember it, and something in my chest loosened that had been clenched tight for 3 years running. I rode her into town myself 2 days before Christmas, the roads too rutted for her to manage alone with the mare pulling a small sled of provisions. Sweetwater at that time of year was as close to festive as a frontier town of 400 souls ever got. A wreath of dried juniper on the mercantile door, the smell of wood smoke thick over the whole street. Children chasing each other between the wagons with a freedom their mothers only allowed at Christmas. Flour ran 3 to 5 cents a pound that winter, and coffee closer to 30. And I watched Meg count out her coins with the same careful precision she brought to my ledger, refusing twice to let me pay for what was hers to buy. She bought sugar and a length of blue ribbon I didn't ask about, and I bought a new lamp wick, and on some impulse I still can't fully account for, a small tin of peppermint drops that I left on the kitchen table 2 mornings later without a word of explanation. She never mentioned finding them. She also never let the tin go empty again that whole winter, and I noticed that too, the way I'd started noticing everything about her comings and goings. The first real turn came in late January when Sutter rode out to the ranch himself, his black suit out of place against the frozen mud of my yard, to inform me that my note was due in full come March, on account of the herd losses the year before having made the bank cautious, as he put it, about carrying me further. I did the arithmetic before he'd finished his sentence. The sale of my spring calves would cover perhaps 2/3 of what I owed. The rest I did not have, and would not have, not honestly, not by March. I told Meg that evening, more out of habit than intention. She'd become the person I told things to, before I'd fully noticed that transformation happening. "You could sell off the north section," she said carefully, "the 100 acres along the creek. That's Ellen's mother's land. It was meant to pass to our children." I heard my own voice go rough. We didn't have children who lived long enough to pass it to. She was quiet a moment. Then, "I understand something about holding on to land that doesn't make sense to hold on to anymore. My claim's the same. Sutter's told me twice now he'd take it off my hands at half what it's worth, and twice I've told him no, and I couldn't tell you honestly why, except that giving it up would mean admitting I can't do this alone. Maybe neither of us has to." I hadn't meant to say it. The words came out ahead of my thinking, the way water finds a crack in a dam before you know the dam has failed. She went very still. I watched her face for the space of several heartbeats, and I opened my mouth to explain myself, to walk it back into something safer, something about hired help and dollar wages and nothing more. And that was the moment the dog started up outside, barking at something in the dark, and by the time I'd gone out with the lantern to see what had spooked him, nothing, as it turned out, likely a coyote passing wide of the fence line, the moment had closed itself over like water after a stone. When I came back in, she'd already gathered her shawl and her ledger and was saying goodnight in a voice that gave nothing away. I did not sleep well that night, turning over what I had almost said and had not finished saying.
February brought the dark part of that winter, in more ways than the calendar accounts for. A blizzard held the whole territory still for the better part of a week, snow drifting to the eaves and the temperature falling low enough to freeze the water trough solid by mid-morning. Meg couldn't get back to her own claim for 4 days running and stayed in the spare room down the hall. And there was something about hearing her moving through the house in the mornings, the creak of the floorboard outside the kitchen, the particular way she banked the stove, that made the house feel less like a place I was merely enduring and more like a place I might actually live in again.
When the blizzard broke, I rode into Sweetwater to find that Sutter had grown impatient with waiting on my note and had begun, quietly, making inquiries about Meg's claim as well, implying to anyone who'd listen that a widow alone, spending her days out at the Hargrove Ranch, wasn't proving up her own land the way the law required, and perhaps the claim ought to revert to the bank on a technicality. It was a cruel and calculated thing, and I understood at once it was aimed at both of us, at driving a wedge of shame between me and the woman I had, by then, admitted to myself I could not do without. When I told her, she went white, then very controlled in the way I'd come to recognize meant she was holding something back by force of will. "I should stop coming," she said, "if it puts my claim at risk." "No." The word came out harder than I meant it. "Meg, no. I won't let a man like Sutter decide what you're allowed to hold on to, not your land, and not—" I stopped myself again. I was becoming a man who stopped himself constantly, and I was tired of it. "Not what?" she asked, very quietly. I looked at her a long moment, at the chestnut hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by late afternoon, at the gold band she still wore on a hand that had spent 2 years proving to the whole territory she needed no one. I thought of Ellen, and of the 4 hours, and of how long I'd told myself that loving anyone again was a debt I couldn't afford to owe. "Not you," I said finally. "I won't let him decide anything about you." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't leave either, and by then I'd learned that with Meg, staying said more than speaking ever did. The turning point came the first week of March, 3 days before my note was due. I rode into town prepared to lose the north section, prepared to lose more than that if it came to it, only to find Sutter already at his desk with a strange, tight look on his face and a letter from the Territorial Land Office in front of him. Meg had ridden in ahead of me, I hadn't known this until later, and had gone through her own claim records with the precision her schoolteacher father had given her, and found that Sutter had misfiled a payment of hers 18 months prior, an error that, properly corrected, meant her claim was not only secure, but that the bank owed her $9 in overcharged interest. She had brought the ledger pages herself, laid them on his desk without a word, and watched him go pale as he checked her figures against his own and found them correct in every column. It was not a grand reversal. Nobody drew a gun, but I understood, watching Sutter's face that morning, that the quiet woman who kept my books had just outmaneuvered a banker at his own arithmetic on behalf of no one but herself, and had done it with the same steady hand she used to balance my own accounts every afternoon at my kitchen table. I had spent 30 years believing that strength on this land looked like enduring hardship without complaint. I understood, watching her, that I had been wrong about what strength looked like the whole time. She used that same precision 2 days later to go through my note with Sutter beside me, and found an error in his interest calculations too. Small, but enough, combined with the sale of the spring calves, to buy me through to summer without selling Ellen's mother's land. Sutter signed the corrected papers with a tightness around his mouth that told me plainly he understood he'd been beaten fair, and there was a strange satisfaction in watching a man who traded in other people's desperation finally meet a ledger he couldn't argue with. We rode back to the ranch together that afternoon, The thaw just beginning to soften the ruts in the road, patches of green showing through the melting snow along the fence line for the first time in months. Neither of us said much until we reached the gate. "I owe you a debt I don't know how to pay in dollars," I told her. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I did it for myself as much as for you. Sutter needed to learn that a widow's figures are as good as any man's." "That's not the debt I meant." She looked at me, and I finally said the thing I'd been circling since November, plainly, without the dog or the dark or my own cowardice to interrupt it this time. "I stopped counting the 4 hours somewhere around January," I said. "I still think of them. I expect I always will. But they don't sit in the center of me the way they used to. I think that has something to do with you." Her eyes went bright, and for a moment I thought she might turn away the way she had before. She didn't. I stopped wondering if I could have caught Daniel's fall and started wondering instead whether I even wanted to keep proving to this whole territory that I didn't need anybody. I don't know that I believe that anymore. I'm not certain I ever fully did. I did not ask her to marry me that afternoon at the gate with mud on both our boots and a banknote only half solved. It would have been the wrong moment, and by then I'd learned the value of not rushing past the ones that mattered. But when we walked up to the house together, I reached over without deciding to and took the ledger from her hands, the one she still carried everywhere out of habit, and set it on the porch step, and neither of us moved to pick it back up for a long while. Spring came on slow that year, the way it does in that country, green creeping up from the creek bottoms before it ever reached the high pasture. Meg kept coming to the ranch through April and into May, though the ledger work had thinned to almost nothing by then, and neither of us pretended anymore that the ledger was the reason. We didn't announce anything to the town. We didn't need to. Sweetwater has a way of knowing things before anyone says them out loud, and by the time the calves were branded that June, nobody so much as raised an eyebrow at her mare being tied at my gate 3 and 4 evenings a week. I think about that first Tuesday sometimes, her standing in my doorway telling me plainly she wouldn't be spoken down to, and I think about how close I came to hiring someone else entirely, a man from town, cheaper still, who'd have done the sums and gone home and never once made me listen for hoofbeats on the road. I don't know what kind of man I'd have stayed if she hadn't come. I don't much care to find out. She never did ask me to say more than I had. She simply moved her chair a little closer to the fire that evening and let the numbers wait until morning. Summer came on hard that year, the way it always did after a slow spring, and I asked her in the last week of June, though not the way I'd imagined asking anyone twice in one lifetime. We were standing in the north pasture, the one along the creek that had once belonged to Ellen's mother, checking a stretch of fence the spring floods had loosened. Meg had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a hammer in one hand, and 3 fence staples held between her teeth the way she'd seen my hired man do it, and she looked so entirely unbothered by the absurdity of the picture she made that I laughed before I'd said a single word of what I'd come out there meaning to say. "What?" she said around the staples, not looking up from the post she was setting. "Nothing." I took the staples from her before she swallowed one, the way I'd started doing with small things that were hers to do herself, and she let me, the way she'd started letting me. "I've been turning something over." "You turn most things over twice before you say them, I've noticed." "This one I've turned over since November." She stopped then, hammer resting against her thigh, and looked at me the way she'd looked at me that night by the lamp when I told her about the 4 hours. Like she already half knew what was coming and meant to let me get there in my own time regardless. I didn't have a ring. I want that told plainly, because I've heard other men's stories dressed up finer than the truth of them. And the truth of mine is that I asked Margaret Doyle to marry me standing in a half-mended fence line with staples in my pocket instead of a ring on my palm, my hat off out of habit more than ceremony, my voice not steady in the way I'd have liked it to be. I've got 4,000 acres and a banknote that isn't fully settled, and a house that still smells of another woman's soap most mornings, though less than it used to, I said. I've got nothing to offer you that you haven't already half-earned keeping my books straight. But I'd like you to stay past the hiring, Meg. I'd like that to be the whole of the arrangement from here on, not wages, not a claim to prove up separate from mine. Just you, staying. She was quiet long enough that I started composing in my head the graceful way a man walks back a proposal that's landed wrong. Then she set the hammer down in the grass, which I'd come to know by then was the closest thing she had to a declaration, and said, I kept telling myself I was riding out here for the $1 a week. Were you? For the first month, maybe. A ghost of a smile. After that, I kept coming because I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't much want to learn. We were married in September, in the front room of the Sweetwater Baptist Church, with maybe 30 people crowded onto benches meant for 20, because a wedding was still a rare enough thing in that country that nobody wanted to miss one, even a plain one between a rancher 20 years past his youth and a widow who'd spent 2 winters proving the whole town wrong about what she could hold on to alone. Meg wore a dress the color of the sky an hour before dusk, made over from one that had belonged to her mother, and I wore the only suit I owned, the collar too tight, the way collars always are on men who spend their lives in open shirts. Sutter did not attend, which nobody remarked on and everybody understood. She kept the ledger after that too, though it had less need of keeping once the ranch was solvent again, and I noticed she never did throw out the first one, the one she'd opened that October afternoon with a frown and a chewed pencil. I found it years later, tucked at the back of a shelf, and opened it out of some sentiment I didn't examine too closely, and found in the margins of the later pages, after the columns, after the sums, small notations that weren't accounting at all. The date the first hard frost came, a line about the peppermint tin, a single sentence dated the November of that first year that read only, "He counts something he thinks I don't notice him counting." I never asked her about it. Some things a person keeps for themselves even inside a marriage, and I'd learned by then not to go reaching for every door left unlatched. Her homestead claim, once it was proved up the following spring, she sold to a young couple newly arrived from Nebraska rather than to Sutter's Bank, at a fair price and on her own terms, and used part of the money to buy the schoolhouse in town new slates for every child enrolled that fall, in memory of her father, she said. Though I've always suspected there was more than her father in the gesture. The rest she put toward cattle of her own, registered under her name alongside mine, because she said a woman who'd proved up 160 acres alone had earned the right to a brand with her own initial in it. And I did not argue, having learned some years back the futility of arguing with Margaret Hargrove once her mind was settled on a thing. We are neither of us young anymore, and the wounds we carried into that first October have not vanished so much as they've quieted, the way a river quiets once it's found its bed. I still think of the 4 hours some nights. She still, I believe, thinks of the barn, but we think of them side by side now, in a house that has come, slowly and without any single dramatic turn I could point to smell more of bread and wood smoke than of anything either of us lost. She still moves her chair closer to the fire some evenings, without asking, and I have long since stopped needing her to ask. And I don't take either lightly. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone they think might need a quiet hour, that's what keeps this going. Wherever you are today,
Whether it's morning or evening, whether the sun is up or the stars are out, I hope this story gave you something warm to carry. May God bless every single one of you who listened today. Every one of you. Until next time.